Okay. Zoom has told me the recording has started, so that means the event can start. Hi, I'm Emily Bowe. I'm the assistant director at the Leventhal Map and Education Center, located inside the Central Library down at Copley. I just want to say a quick thank you to Shane at the JP branch and Gretchen from the JP Historical Society for having us come down and give this talk. And thanks to whoever's idea it was to have this. I was very excited to get an orange shirt. Okay, cool. So thank you. Great idea. It was a fun chance for me to take a stroll through this subsection of our collection at the center. So hopefully for the folks on the Zoom, you are here for mapping places from above. I am going to we're going to save all questions until the end, and Gretchen's going to help me manage the Zoom questions. If you can knock all the lights down just so the screen is darkest. Yeah, there we go. Cool. I think it's going to be easier to see maps this way. I've got links to everything, and I will share quickly the link for those on Zoom. Sorry, I should have had this ready to go. Okay, so if you are at home, hopefully that link should work for you so you can see the slides as I'm going, if that's easier. But for everyone else, we're gonna get started. So I figured, just in case, how many people in this room have heard of the Map Center or have been down to see? Okay, great. So I will skip a little bit through quickly this next section. Leventhal Map and Education Center, it's an independent nonprofit that was created to serve as the caretakers and the curators of the library's map collection. BPL has been collecting maps since the 1870s. There's about 250,000 maps in the collection at last estimate. And we do lots of things, all the way from gallery exhibitions to university teaching to K-12 teaching to events like this. So there's kind of a wide mandate for how we think about kind of geographic thinking and being able to use the maps to explore history of Greater Boston. Right now, if you have not been down to our gallery recently, we have a new exhibition on display, Getting Around Town. It's on the history of Boston's transportation system. Our guest curator, Stephen Boucher, owns Ward Maps in Cambridge and wrote the book Boston in Transit. So come check it out. I think it's quite interesting. 400 years of transportation compressed into about a 90-foot gallery. So there's a lot there. But today we're here to talk about bird's eye views, bird's eye maps, which are a really interesting subset of maps. And perhaps despite maybe some thought that they're a distinctly American thing, the idea of kind of being able to map something from above goes well before we start seeing interesting maps of American cities sort of from a hovering view above them. These are two examples that I just put mostly because they're an interesting way to dive into thinking about these as much as art as they are something that shows kind of geographic place and can tell you a little bit about the history of whatever you're looking at. So on the left, and I don't expect a ton of detail, I'm going to kind of narrate us through these because these are just where we're starting off. It's a map from 1672 that was actually a Dutch map of New York. It was what it was supposed to be, so New Amsterdam. But in the top in the top left here, there's a little inset map kind of showing something that vaguely looks like Manhattan, Hudson River Valley, Long Island Sound. But the map really is hard to understand. And the reason it's hard to understand is because it's actually a copy of a map that was for a completely different place. It was for a Portuguese city. And so it was copied. That was the sort of standard of the time. It was this Portuguese city. So the topography of it is actually not New York at all. It was copied and meant to be kind of a display map that would be bought back in Europe of this new Dutch city. And it's actually a pretty anachronistic map because at that time, the Dutch were not even in control of New Amsterdam anymore. It had become an English colony. So it's an interesting thing, but it's starting to show this kind of rise in perspective very much at the same time that a lot of kind of fine art is also playing with perspective and three-dimensionality and how you represent things. But a little bit, but 100 years later, once you get into the 1700s, this map is kind of the beginning of these kind of survey maps of a city that allow you to see the whole thing at once. So this is of Paris. As you can see, it's many sheets This process took about 6 years, and it's from when he drew it with his team to when it was actually printed. It's an incredible map. But these were kind of what existed, but they're very, very different from the kind of American bird's eye views that we're going to kind of roll through for the rest of the presentation. And there's a couple reasons for that, but I will. So this map is a map of Lowell. And it's pretty typical for a map, a bird's eye map of this era. This kind of striking perspective, a little makes you a little dizzy. You have to kind of orient yourself to figure out where you are. These maps typically paid no attention to any kind of cartographic practice of where you put north. That was never really the point of these. And it's actually a really good specimen to sort of showcase in this particular map, because that's what Lowell was doing at that particular time, the industrial character of the city and this kind of industry and the economy. These maps, one way to think about them is as much kind of a booster tool. They were meant to be kind of an advertisement for places as much as a map that shows you how to get from A to B. So this is kind of the classic, what you'll see from basically just after the Civil War to the turn of the century. There's other kinds of maps similar to this that, like this map, which is we had this in an exhibition a few years ago. And I always love talking about it because it's a bird's eye view of Boston, but it's one of the strangest I've ever seen. Partially because it's from an angle that no one can really clock. It's very hard to figure out where you are. But it illustrates a really good thing that I think is helpful to keep in mind when thinking about these kinds of maps. So this is the map in the bottom. It says bird's eye view of Boston. The big red building that is very much the center foregrounded kind of subject here. On the bottom, it's you see B and C in red, and it's the Beach and Claridge Soda Water Company. So it was this factory. It's made soda, and the map was sponsored by them. So it's as much an advertisement for them as anything else. But we talked a lot when we had that exhibition about how kind of being able to parse out perhaps who paid for these things, what was the perspective of whoever was drawing them. If an alien dropped to Earth and this was the only map they saw of Boston, perhaps they might think the Beach and Claridge Soda Water Factory was a very important place in Boston, whereas all of us today have probably never heard of it because the factory went out of business about 2 years after this map was produced. So all to say, these maps are kind of need to be considered as much as a piece of art and be able to sort of use your sort of critical art lens as much as any kind of geographic or historical lens when you're looking at them. Two of the things that made these maps so prolific in the United States that were kind of unique to an American context, and I apologize, this is one of my favorite things in our collection, despite it not really being a map. It's also a little hard to see. It's the back of my business card, so I know this one very, very well. Basically, the title says, rank of the most populous cities at each census between 1790 and 1890. So on the top, you have a running list of censuses. Censi, I don't actually know what the plural of that is. With the top one, and I'm actually gonna, just for all who have the slides, I've linked anything I'm showing down at the bottom here. So in this case, I'm actually going to open this in our digital collections. Anything that I link to, you can get the full, really high res scans and zoom all the way in, and it's a much better viewing experience. So occasionally I will be hopping back and forth between these. So the way this is set up, on the kind of vertical axis, you've got a bunch of city names, and they're associated with a particular color. So if you are interested in paying attention to Boston, Boston is this kind of pink here. And then across the horizontal axis, it's sort of a reverse timeline. So 1890 is the first one you see, and then it progressively gets, it goes further back in time to the first census. And this is looking at basically the populations of cities across these different censuses. So you can see in the very beginning, the number of cities that are charted in any particular, in this first census is very few. Gloucester even makes the top list here, which is certainly not true in later years. Boston's number 3 after New York and Philadelphia. And you can start to see you know, especially as the country grows, as more land is added, as westward expansion and sort of taking of land occurs, you have an increasing number of cities that get added to this list. And the maybe where the beginning of this kind of century of censuses had a very New England focus, as you sort of get further ahead, you start to see many more Midwestern cities, West Coast cities. And so the reason I stuck this in here was mostly to kind of have you thinking about what's happening in the country in the period between the 1840s and to the early 1900s, is how much population is expanding, how many cities are being created, how much industry is a piece of that. So you have these new cities that are getting created. You have old cities that have all kinds of industry that is powering them, and they're all fighting in many ways for growth, for population, for money. So that's kind of one narrative that's happening in the background. The other thing, and I'm going to close out here. Sorry, I'm battling windows here. Okay. So the other piece that is happening that creates this phenomenon of these bird's eye views in the United States is the adoption and spread of lithography, which this was a fun thing because I am trained in urban planning and environmental science and geography, but I am not trained in printmaking. So I got to learn a little bit about lithography to give this talk. And Boston has a very storied history with lithographic printers. We had a number of them here, Louis Prang, Pendleton. They were very famous printers. But one of the interesting things is that lithography allowed basically this mass spread of images in a way that other kinds of printing never had before. So suddenly you had the ability to make these maps and print them in the hundreds and the thousands to sell them. And so these bird's eye views became kind of this hot item where people wanted to be able to own the map of the city they were from. They wanted to be able to see their house. There's a very famous scholar who just recently passed away, John Reps, who kind of wrote the literal book on bird's eye views. And he has this great quote: "Owners of these prints displayed them on the walls of parlors, offices, and such public places as banks, hotels, government buildings. Everyone regarded these urban views as convincing evidence of their city's prosperity and importance, and looked on them with pride, consulted them for information, sent them to friends, or admired them as decoration for their homes or places of business." So these were as much sort of a proof of, these maps were as much a proof of kind of the greatness of wherever you lived, but a lot of the spread of these things and the popularity was undergirded by this lithographic kind of process and economy. Just out of curiosity, how many people actually know how a lithograph is made? If everyone raises their hand, I'm going to not play this video, but since only 2 people did, I am going to play this video. So I found this, it's only 2 minutes long. I found the shortest one I could. Basically runs through the process. The general process involves, especially at the time they would have been making these, some kind of stone, typically like a limestone. And basically there's a process of drawing on it with some kind of a wax or something that basically can have the ink stick to it, where the ink would otherwise wash off of the stone. So you're basically using the, how water and oil don't mix, they'll repel each other. You're using something that will grab the ink to keep it on there. But there's kind of a whole process that enables it. It's kind of cool. So we're gonna watch this really quickly. Color is an interesting subset of this too, but I won't bore you with that. If we get into the Q&A, we can talk about how color was applied in some of these, but you'll see it in some of these maps. So that's basically it. And one question that I think might come up is, how do you get a map like that onto a stone? There was an invention of this transfer paper. So one question I've gotten when talking about these is, how did any of the people that made these maps, how could they possibly have gotten that view? And the fact is that they didn't get that view. It's an imagined view in the artist's render. There was, even though this is in the time when someone could have theoretically taken a hot air balloon, typically the way these cartographers and artists were doing things is it was based on a number of sketches that were either done for individual buildings as they were walking around the city, getting up to high points in church steeples or hills or sort of vantage points where they could look down and get whatever the highest perspective there was there. But otherwise, the perspectives are imagined. They're not actually what they were able to see in most cases. There's lots of stories of these lithographers and the artists actually walking around towns for like months at a time to take individual sketches of buildings that were going to be prominent so they could get the facades right. So they did all of that, and you'll see later, it's very rare to find any of their sketches that they actually made. They write about it, but there's not a lot that have survived. But we have one manuscript copy. So basically what was drawn before it was actually put into the stone to be made into the lithographs. We actually have one of those in the collection that I'll show later. It's very cool to see the kind of draft version and then what ends up on the actual lithograph. So that's just kind of a little process. I like material culture a lot, so I figured we could give a little bit of that just to begin. So for the rest of it, we're going to look at bird's eye views. I've got a series that kind of go between 1850 and 1902. There's one of JP, which many of you may know well or may have copies of, that's at the very end. And then I've got a few resources that if you're super jazzed and want to learn more, you can follow the links and go check out books either from the library or go check out Library of Congress resources. So yeah, so this first one, this is it may look kind of similar because it sort of has a similar perspective-ish from that very strange Beach and Claridge one. It's from the west. We're sort of hovering over what would today be the Back Bay. It's from 1850, so the filling of the Back Bay is maybe in political imaginations, but and maybe has started in parts, but is not nearly completed. You can see here in the bottom, it's a little hard. We're gonna jump over to the digitized version here. In the bottom here, it looked kind of like it was filled, but you can tell pretty clearly that that's still marshy. The Back Bay, that's the marshy Back Bay right up against the public gardens. But you can see some kind of blocks maybe starting here that are kind of going towards where Copley Square would be today. But this is from 1850. It was done by Jonathan Bachmann, who was a German lithographer. And he was one of the earliest producers of these kinds of images and maps. He produced two, one in 1850 and one that we'll see that's a little bit later. But this is kind of, you know, the creation of the public garden, the common, these sort of jewels of Boston at this point. It makes a lot of sense that those might be, especially as the city is expanding and about to create this new neighborhood, that those would be featured, but perhaps a lot of the kind of open sewer that was the Back Bay or was the Fens at the time is sort of kept out of view. You can see in the distance here just how imaginative the harbor was meant to be in terms of busyness. That's one of the things I kind of invite you to pay attention to through these different views. These harbor views especially are made to look like it is rush hour at all times, and there are so many more ships than there probably were at any one time. So it's interesting to sort of see, you'll see in another view, there's one that has little clipper ships that kind of mark the beginning of Boston's decline as a wooden shipbuilding city that are pocketed in the bay. But this one, you can still see Long Wharf. You can see kind of how much the city still relied on kind of the wharves at that point. One thing to note, a lot of the transportation infrastructure we would know today as North Station is not quite fully yet in place. So you see little rail coming here and some bridges, but in other bird's eye views, they make a real meal out of showing the big train station with all of the lines coming in as a way of showing kind of Boston's economic prominence and importance in the region. So these but this one is early enough as well. You'll note that it's kind of a it's kind of this, you know, faded yellowish, and it's black. When they were talking about two color printing and lithography, there's a couple of phases of it. Some were printed with black ink on everything and then hand colored. Others later, there's a technique that gets created to print with multiple hues, multiple pigments. So there's like 3 colors you print with: a black, a yellow, and a blue, so that when the yellow and the blue are combined, you can get green. You'll see that in a couple other ones, but this one is just black ink. So we'll go to the back here. So this one is next up in the order here, and it's a fun one because it's one of 2 that we have that actually is attributed to a specific date. There's one, so this is just supposed to be July 4th, 1870. And this one will be important for me to be able to zoom in. Oops. Come on. There we go. Okay. So we truly are even in a more imagined perspective, much higher even than where we were before. By this point in 1870, you can see the Back Bay is no longer an imaginary. It is a filled in, at least, neighborhood with blocks, if not, doesn't have all of its buildings quite built yet. Which is kind of a wild thing to just think about, these very rectilinear blocks just being created out of nothing at a time like that, when every other street in Boston at the time would have been these zigzaggy messes. So I can only imagine what the thought was, just how pretty and beautiful these streets were when they were pristine. But I'm sure part of this was artistic liberty. But you can see out in the harbor, you'll see the 2 forts here, with flags at full mast flying. Must have been a very windy day on this artist's rendering here, with cannons firing, lots of patriotic showmanship, I guess, happening in the mind of this artist. But you can start to see by this point, so you've got all of these wooden ships, but you'll start to see these clipper ships here with the smokestacks. Which were kind of the beginning of the end of Boston's shipbuilding, wooden shipbuilding. So it was an interesting inclusion on the part of the artist. And the thing that you will start to notice as well, I was mentioning earlier, the like the transportation infrastructure, and that being very much kind of a way of signaling to people, both factories and transportation were 2 of the big things in these bird's eye views that sort of signaled how important your city was, or how important the economy was there. And you'll start to see the beginnings of North Station consolidation, and you kind of start to see some of what becomes Back Bay Station over here, with these train lines coming in. And these are quite detailed. Like, I can zoom all the way in, and these little people are even slightly formed in a way where I can tell that they're people, which is very impressive when you think about how tiny that would have been on a sheet that is probably no more than maybe 3 feet wide. But yeah, so this is an example of one of those multicolored lithographs in terms of printing technique. Okay. So this next one is really interesting. There's sort of this and the one right after it kind of go together in a pair. These were done by Charles Parsons, and this one is the only other one we have that's dated to a specific date. So it's November 30th, 1872. And actually, does anyone know when the fire was in 1872? It's less than a month before this. Anyone know the date? November 9th. And it's published in Harper's Bazaar. So this is basically a news image that went out to try to explain to people what had happened. But what's interesting about it is they had to do it really fast for a publication deadline. Charles Parsons is a very prolific bird's eye map artist, but he was also the art director at Harper's Bazaar. So he actually used his sketches for a piece that he was working on with the lithographer Currier Ives, the very famous sort of fancy Currier Ives. And he used those sketches to very quickly make this, which is trying to show basically the extent of the Great Fire that took out what would kind of today be sort of the financial district over to kind of like where the post office is downtown. And there's a really interesting, for anyone who's interested in fire insurance atlases, how many people have used Atlascope in this room? Love it. Music to my ears. Okay, for those that haven't, Atlascope is our tool that we developed, which I will put a link in the chat later, that basically allows you to preview maps that were made as part of fire insurance, which was a direct kind of outcome of many American cities having these major fires, Chicago, San Francisco, Boston. And so this one took out a very large chunk of the city. But those atlases are really amazing as a historical research tool. So probably a minimal crowd to that kind of thing if you haven't checked it out yet. But this next lithograph is actually the same Charles Parsons. And this was the one that he was working on with Currier and Ives. And you can kind of tell that it's a little more grand. It's a pretty stunning image. I'll quickly make it really big so that we can explore it. And it's kind of really leaning into this kind of grand thing that you'd be very proud to hang on your wall if you owned a copy of this. So here at the bottom, you can see Currier and Ives, published in New York. And they have running along the bottom here kind of these labels that roughly track to sort of what's happening above them. So it's a little tricky for me to be able to both have you be able to read the labels and see everything above it. So you'll have to maybe check this out on your own. But it's a very complicated print, and it's also kind of playing with perspective in a way that is really interesting. It's sort of coming from the Northeast. East Boston is behind you, but the perspective is a little off. But you really get a sense of how much Boston has grown. And how much of the city is kind of, the city at this point has annexed multiple of the towns around it. And the Back Bay is sort of fully filled in here up to what becomes the Fens. You can kind of see that was still, this is maybe a generous representation of what that looked like at that time, based on other maps I've seen of the Fens at the time. You can see Cambridge's waterfront looks very different than it does today. Doesn't have any of the fill where like MIT would be. But you really get a sense of this kind of bustling harbor with these giant ships, the wharves, just how packed kind of the wharf line was, and how much industry was happening here. And then also you really do get the kind of like final buildup of all the trains coming in here. There we go. Yeah, through here. The Navy Yard over here, looking like it is doing quite a busy day, I guess, with the smokestack at that point. But what's really interesting is this this one was kind of the one of the like hallmark lithographs of these bird's eye views for Boston at the time. One technique that they talk a lot about in the literature about bird's eye views was how much they tried to represent like as many buildings as they could, because each building, sort of the owner of it or the occupant of it or whoever was a potential customer of these maps, was a potential buyer. So there's an incredible amount of detail, which I would have to really kind of go block by block to see how much it lines up with cadastral records of the time or other kinds of maps, but they really do fill every little nook and cranny, at least in the foreground. And then as they get further back, obviously, it's more of a idea more than an actual representation, but it is a pretty stunning map to be able to explore. And it's interesting to be able to see what they actually call out. Right, it's a lot of the kind of the civic buildings, the churches, the markets, things that would have been the kind of important landmarks at the time. So it's one of my personal favorites. It's actually the background of my computer right now. So, but actually, sorry. The one other thing I was going to say though, this was, I was mentioning that Parsons kind of cribbed from his own drawings when he did the fire kind of piece for Harper's. This one actually shows the burned area as if it was still there, even though it's published a year later, because the work had already happened and the press was already, like the printing process was already in motion. So they come out, this one comes out after the other one that actually shows what happened, but it's an interesting sort of anachronism of what was actually there is not what's shown in that map at the time. So we saw a Bachmann map at the very beginning, and this is from 1850. This is his other one that he did of Boston. And it's kind of an unusual perspective. There aren't a ton that take this kind of from the north, kind of from kind of Charlestown, Somerville area, and it's basically hovering. You really get a sense of what they're trying to foreground is what becomes North Station, the train station, with these big plumes of very aggressive steam and smoke. And you'll start to see they highlight buildings with this kind of white treatment here to be able to show buildings that are important, to make them pop against this kind of otherwise very visually similar register. You can see here the State House with the reservoir that used to exist right behind it. So before the State House was expanded to the back, one of the city's water reservoirs was there, which makes sense. One of the bigger hills, put water up there, have it flow down. But you can see some of these kind of the customs house. You'll see all these other buildings that are kind of meant to stand out. And then you can see, so this is 1877. And you can see that, this is where it's interesting to think about the creation of an imaginary about what Back Bay looked like at the time, or like what it was going to be. Part of it had been filled, but there's all this area that they're showing just still to be a marsh. And so it's always really interesting to kind of track between photographs that you have from the late 19th century, illustrations like this, other kinds of maps, to sort of see, because there's in many ways, especially for folks who were wrapped up in trying to sell real estate or trying to promote sale of property, a lot of times these maps have a bit of a they project it as it could be or will be, maybe more than it is right now. So I always kind of find it interesting to see where the state of the landfill is in any given map like that. Okay, so these next two also go in a little pair here. This is a lithograph by O.H. Bailey and James Hazen. O.H. Bailey's name comes up over and over and over again. If you start to look at these, he was one of the most prolific bird's eye view makers. And he and his brother both did it. They traveled together. They started in the Midwest and then came east. So he basically, almost every major Massachusetts city has an O.H. Bailey that he did. This one is from 1879, and it's probably one of the largest that we have. Physically, this piece is a little over 4 feet. It's big. And what's interesting to me about it is both the level of detail, and we'll kind of zoom in a little bit. That is quite remarkable to see, especially in a single color. He has, I don't know if I'm going to be able to zoom any more in, but he has street names, like this is Summer Street, and he has you can see carriages and horses, and he's got all the wharves labeled. It's a pretty remarkable kind of, snapshot, at least of the things that are in the foreground that you really can get details of. But one of the reasons that it's so interesting is because you really do get a sense of kind of the rest of the filling of the fens. And it's one of the first times you see this kind of Frederick Law Olmsted's design sort of at least represented in one of these views. So this is whereas we just saw in the 1877 one that was just from 2 years earlier, kind of this open area, this is starting to show perhaps what might have been in the works, but was not yet completed, at least fully. But you can also see the kind of surrounding towns here on the horizon, and they're labeled. So you can see Newton in the back, and Brighton and Brookline. So it really is a pretty kind of expansive representation. But part of the reason it's so interesting, and I'll go back now, is because we actually have the manuscript that went into making this lithograph. So this is the manuscript. So this was his drawn copy that he made before it actually was transferred. Sorry, and this one is worth kind of diving into a little more, because you really start to see a little more of the handwork, and I'm going to try to get as close as I possibly can here. So you'll see here, there's some pencil marks that are showing squares that should be there. All of the buildings, which otherwise are noted as places of interest on the lithograph, are shown with these red annotations that ultimately are not read in the final one, but it's so that whoever's transferring this to the lithographic process knows that those need to be emphasized. He has this kind of white call out here to basically be able to kind of emphasize certain buildings, but also I think there's a thought that basically the places where the white kind of coloring is places where he went back and redid some things and was fixing things that maybe weren't there in the beginning. But what's really interesting, you'll see little details that changed between his original manuscript and then what actually got printed with the lithograph. So one of the more obvious ones, just because it's in which maybe obvious is maybe not the right word. One of the ones that's fun to see and is easy to see once you point it out is the roundhouse here. So these were the places where trains would come in. If anyone has kids or grandkids that have watched Thomas the Tank Engine, the roundhouse that turns. So this is the roundhouse is kind of like a ovalish shape, and the final one ends up being much more circular. Let's see if I can go back and show you that. It's down here. They kind of fill it out and make it a little more proper. So these things are always kind of an interplay between the original drafter and the person who's actually transferring it and making the lithograph. So it's a very technical process, which is always really interesting to me to see kind of the handwork behind it, but it's also very cool because normally you don't really get to see that many manuscript versions of these. So it's exciting that we have this one. Okay, I've got a couple more. How are we doing? We good? Okay, I'm gonna keep rolling and then we'll get to questions. So this one is from 1899. This is sort of almost turn of the century. The next one I'll show you is actually called 20th century Boston. It's a very flashy, 3 years later, very flashy, looks very different. You can tell the artists were hard at work making Boston look very modern compared to this one. But this one has a lot going on. We use it for teaching a lot, especially with university students, because there is a lot to unpack. And it is kind of, this is the height of kind of Boston's kind of industrial eminence and trade eminence and transportation eminence at the time in the region. And as you start to get into the 20th century, a lot of those things start to shift as the economy moves. And but you can start to really see a lot of the infrastructure that's been built to connect Boston with surrounding suburbs, with Maine, with New Hampshire, with Vermont, and the smokestacks that kind of dot every little part of the map. All of these little smokestacks and steeples, those are the two things that you can really see as you're looking around. By this point, you can see Cambridge. You see the familiar edge of Cambridge that we're used to today relative to the perhaps natural edge of Cambridge. So MIT would be plopped right here if we were hovering in a helicopter over the river today. But you can see at this time, this is at least what the artist is rendering it as. And you can also see, so let's see if I can, you'll see right here, well, I can't zoom in anymore, but labeled as number 4, and I'll point for people in the room. Central Library, which had been built in 1895 was when it opened. So this is 1899. So you'll see that, you see the, oh, thank you, Gretchen, that's very helpful. Yeah, and you'll see a lot of the train infrastructure. I always find it really entertaining to be able, when we look at Atlascope with folks, show that the Prudential is built on this giant set of rail lines that are basically underneath it all. A lot of people forget that that's there, or don't realize that it's there, but it's basically the footprint of the Pru is sitting right on top of that very large rail yard, which is interesting to see. So this one, both because of how much growth there is, and by this point, much of the land making has already occurred in Boston that we're kind of familiar with today. So it's kind of easier to see places that you might know today. So it's a very interesting map to teach with. And then this final one. So this is, sorry, 6 years later after. So this is 1905. And boy, does this city, this Boston looks much different than the Boston that was in that 1899 one. It feels distinctly modern in a different kind of way. Partially because the way they render the perspectives, these buildings seem much taller than the surrounding areas, giving rise to this kind of feeling of these taller buildings and skyscrapers. But also you see all of these cutter ships in the harbor that kind of are a very different vibe than the wooden ships, masted ships that you see in the older ones. This one is actually the last recorded that we've been able to find of the bird's eye views like this, kind of in the sort of 19th century style. So this one's 1905. So it's kind of the latest one we have, although there are plenty of kind of modern reinterpretations. There's actually a really cool one that is in our digital collections that is of Jamaica Plain, but it's a modern rendering in so very, very interesting. But this is kind of the last one that we have. And the one I want to end on is actually of JP, which feels very fitting. And Gretchen was telling me that this one may have been used in a walking tour at some point. So many of you may be familiar with it. If you would like to print it out and put it on your wall somewhere, you can do that by going to the collections record on their website and actually downloading the image. There's a little button down here. It says download. So if this strikes your fancy, feel free. What I found really interesting in kind of digesting this one was the prominence of the Sturtevant factory, which was a factory of like fans. It's over by Green Street now. Some of the buildings remain, but it's positioned kind of front and center in this map. It takes the sort of center position that here, and then in other parts of it, there's I think this top left one. This is the residence of Mrs. Sturtevant. And then I believe there is a residence of the Sturtevant son-in-law, I think is maybe the top right. I think that's Cia Farrington. But there's a very familiar building here in the top. So we're, right there, or right here, I guess, just to the right. So this became kind of, many of the ones that I showed you were more of just the bird's eye view, but this kind of style of having individual buildings showcased along the edges was very much a common thing, especially if you look nationally at other cities, particularly in cities where they were really trying to play up what was there if maybe they weren't as big and they were growing, especially like west of the Mississippi. So you see lots of churches, lots of kind of prominent homes, but especially with these kinds of ones, sometimes depending on what they're featuring or showcasing, it might give you a sense of perhaps who helped pay for these or commissioned them. So I have some sense that perhaps the Sturtevant company might have had a hand in commissioning this map, which this is after JP is annexed into Boston. So it's at this point, it's a streetcar suburb, but it's kind of highlighting both the industry that's present here, but also you see in the background, the pond is right there. Center Street right here, all kinds of little people walking through. So it's a very, very fun map to be able to look at. I'm happy at the end we can, if people want to see any particular part of it, we can zoom in. But I want to make sure I leave time for questions. So I'm gonna quickly just finish up. If you are leaving tonight and you really want to keep exploring bird's eye maps, I've got a couple of things for you. So there's a book called Boston and Beyond, which was actually the exhibition catalog for an exhibition we did 15 years ago. I checked the date, 2008. And there's 20 copies in the system. So I know that the JP copy is in right now because I just made this screenshot today, so I wouldn't be out of date. There's also, I mentioned that there was the kind of a person who wrote the book on bird's eye views. This is John Repp's book here, Views and Viewmakers of Urban America. It's a very expansive thing. It covers much more than just Boston. It's where I was able to get all of my notes about who was most prolific. O.H. Bailey, there's a whole chart about when he made maps and how many he made. But it covers cities across the country. It's a really incredible volume. Boston and Beyond, the beyond part of it includes all of Massachusetts. So there's inland towns and coastal towns. So I've actually got a copy of the book with me. I brought it. So if you want to peek at it at all today, let me know. We can see that at the end. And then just a quick plug, the Library of Congress has an amazing bird's eye view collection. They call it their panoramic map collection. So cities across the country, if you're looking for your hometown or where your kids live or whatever, they probably have a copy of it, and they're pretty interesting to be able to view. I'm including an Atlas Scope link, so we'll send out the slides. If you haven't checked it out, please do. I will also quickly, we made some improvements to it recently, earlier this year. So I'll quickly demo it if you haven't seen it. So I was explaining earlier, these show fire insurance atlases, and they're overlaid on top of a kind of modern map that you might be used to using like in Google Maps or something. I'm gonna move this up here for right now. But you can also search for an address. So like, actually, let's do State House for right now. So you can search for a modern address, it'll take you there. You can change the years for the atlases. So right now there's a number of atlases there. This was what I was talking about earlier. There was a reservoir right behind the State House before it expanded to the back. But the part that I always like to show people, because it's extra cool, is we've enabled a search feature where basically you can search Digital Commonwealth, which is a digital repository of images and maps and writings and anything from museums, universities, libraries across the state of Massachusetts. So basically anything that's tagged with location data that falls within that circle on the screen, if I hit search photographs, it's going to pull up photographs, historic photographs from that area. So it's kind of an interesting way to be able to go from historic research you might be doing to find other materials. So I quickly wanted to say that in case people hadn't gotten a chance to try that yet. And then let me move this back down. I'm almost done, I promise. Now we're Q&A. We're there. Okay, thank you. Gretchen, do you want lights on for the Q&A, or do you want to keep lights off? Partial? Can someone that's close to the back maybe hit that? Shane, thank you. Okay, I'm gonna let Gretchen be the moderator between Zoom and in person so that I don't have to be the picker.
No, sure. Why did these maps go out of favor around the turn of the century?
Yeah, so they started to become so for anyone who is, and I'll actually I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so that it's just me now. Best I can tell, the way they started to go out of favor mostly because photography became, like, airplanes and photography started to become de rigueur, and so that became a different way to see cities at that time. So you had aerial photographs that were able to sort of give you a different perspective on things. For the most part, the maps that were popular were about a generation before airplanes. So it was a very revolutionary idea to be able to see your city from that height, but it stopped being revolutionary once you could do it for real. Yeah. Yeah. Question?
Yeah, can you speak more to how they transferred from the manuscript map on this lithograph?
I will do my best, but I'm going to say this is not I looked this up and really tried to understand it, and the writing on it is very vague. Basically, there was transfer. So the question was, how did they get it from the manuscript to the lithographic stone? There's a transfer paper that gets invented in the 1860s, I think, that basically allows, I was imagining it as I was reading about it, a little bit like a receipt paper where you're drawing and there's like another piece underneath that's picking it up. The transfer paper basically allowed you to be able to draw it as you would normally draw it, as opposed to having to draw it in reverse. Because if you were drawing on the lithographic stone directly, you had to do a mirror image of what you were trying to print, which if you saw those maps, that would be very difficult to try to flip that and do it in reverse. So the transfer paper somehow allowed there to be a like shift from one to the other. John Repp's book has a whole section on it that's about lithographic improvements. So I will direct you to that if you have more questions.
So there's a question from online. What about small town views? Did the same map makers produce those? It looks like an enormous investment of time and profitable small views make a profit.
Yeah, well, so with small views, actually, one of the things that's interesting is you have an ability to actually visualize everything at a greater level of detail. So it allowed people to actually be like, that's my house, or that's my building, or whatever. And so there's a number of smaller towns, especially the Boston and Beyond book has a number of towns kind of across Massachusetts that weren't big cities at the time that had views like this. And typically they were like an investment on behalf of the sort of town fathers or founding, whoever was trying to sort of grow the town. But the smaller places actually became, I think what I was reading was basically you had an easier sell because most people could find themselves in that faster than they could in one of the views of Boston, especially later when it's kind of, as you get further out, it's a lot more, a lot less detailed. Yeah. Okay.
Do we know what those maps sold for?
Great.
Not necessarily in dollars.
In dollars today.
Kind of, yeah.
They were made affordably. I don't know what the actual, I can find out, but they were made so that they were basically mass produced so that you could afford one. They weren't super expensive like like a woodcut or something that was much more time intensive to make, but I don't know the exact dollar amount of what they would have been sold for. So.
It occurs to me that sometimes when you go visit a city or a town or a vacation spot, they have these tourist maps that are mostly commercial things that are pointing out the sponsors of the advertisements, but don't those have the same look, the same bird's eye kind of thing?
Yeah, that's very similar. The difference is really that the lithographic technique isn't there. So it's a bird's eye view, but it's not the sort of maybe the like definitional bird's eye that they kind of refer to in kind of the museum world. Yeah, it's the same thing. And actually the term bird's eye, one of the maps that I showed, it was actually the first time that it had ever been used to describe that kind of map. Like that was a term that was someone just made up to be able to kind of advertise what it was. So it's a term that kind of gets created along the way. So it certainly still applies to those kinds of maps you're talking about.
Question in the chat about how did a young woman get involved in this?
Is that referring to me? Oh, okay, great. So my background's in urban planning and environmental science, and if you study urban planning these days, you will probably make maps at some point in there. So got my start in cartography in undergrad and then graduate school, and got a job right out of graduate school at the Map Center. So that was 2 years ago. I was one of the like pandemia grad school kids. So it was grad school online for part of it, but yeah, have kind of a funny background in architecture and design and maps, and I joke that I'm a professional urban nerd, so that's that. I'm happy to stick around too if you don't want to ask in front of a whole crowd. Otherwise, thank you to everyone online. I'm sorry I was kind of up and back, but I'm glad you tuned in, and thank you for being here in person. Okay, amazing, great. I'm gonna stop the recording. Yeah.